This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
In Washington, D.C., 4 activists remain in the Venezuelan embassy after police raided the building Monday night. Activists with Codepink, Answer Coalition, and Popular Resistance have been inside the building since late April at the invitation of Venezuela's government in order to prevent it from being taken over by Venezuela's U.S.-backed opposition led by Juan Guaidó.
Last week, authorities cut off water and electricity to the Venezuelan embassy. As they were on the verge of being raided Monday, activists released a video statement vowing to continue the fight.
We're not going to leave voluntarily. We came here to protect the embassy. We've been here for 34 days. We would stay longer if necessary. We hope that this still results in an agreement between Venezuela and the United States to protect this embassy from the fake government, the fake coup non-government that the U.S. is pushing forward. So we're here. We're still resisting.
To find out more, we're going to Washington, D.C. to speak with Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Codepink, one of the activists living inside the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., demanding the embassy not be turned over to the Venezuelan opposition leaders. Medea, welcome back to Democracy Now! Explain the standoff right now.
It's a remarkable situation, Amy. 2 days ago, the police came in with a fake eviction notice. It was written on a piece of paper that had no letterhead, no seal, no signature. We didn't know who it came from. And the police read this out as if it were an official eviction notice. Our lawyer, who has been fantastic, Mara Verheyden-Hilliard, went to speak to the people remaining in the embassy, and they discussed the situation and said they were not going to leave. The only way they would leave is once there is an arrangement between Venezuela and the United States as to what will happen to both embassies, an arrangement that respects the Vienna Convention. And so the police cut the locks on the doors, and they read the eviction notice, and our brave heroes inside the embassy said that they would not leave. We all thought that this was the end, that they were going to be carried out. The Guaidó supporters outside were cheering, and instead the police turned around, closed the doors, put the lock back on, and left. And so that is the situation today. Nothing happened yesterday. We thought they would come back with some kind of court order. They did not. And the standoff remains. This is quite a remarkable chapter in history where very brave, valiant U.S. citizens, both inside the embassy at the permission of the legal Venezuela government, and people outside who have been facing harassment, being arrested for trying to bring food into the embassy, have held onto that embassy now for 5 weeks and continue to do so.
Well, Medea, I want to read from the eviction notice. It read in part, quote, Ambassadors Vecchio and Gustavo Tade have requested and directed anyone who is present on this property to depart from it immediately and to not return without these ambassadors' express authorization. Any person who refuses to comply with these requests and orders to depart from this property will be trespassing in violation of federal and District of Columbia law, may be arrested and criminally prosecuted. But now there's only one problem, Medea. Any embassy is in effect, isn't it international territory? So this whole issue of even the D.C. police being involved in this is questionable, to say the least?
Absolutely, Juan. We have the law on our side, invited by the government that is in power, the government that is recognized by the United Nations. It is very clear in the Vienna Conventions in Article 45 that even if there is a rupture of relations between 2 states, the hosting country has to respect the integrity of the diplomatic premises. The U.S. knows this very well. The State Department knows this very well. And we have been very clear that anybody who illegally enters that embassy to try to evict us is committing an illegal act and will be held accountable. There are people in the U.S. government that also recognize the grave precedent that this would establish. that it would have repercussions against U.S. embassies around the world. We want to protect not only the Venezuela embassy from takeover by an illegal group, but we want to prevent the Maduro government from taking over the U.S. embassy in Caracas. And there is a very easy answer to all of this that has been used since the 1800s, and that is called the empowering. It's the protection power agreement, that we get an outside country, a third party, and that party then becomes the one in charge of the building. This has happened in the case of Iran, in Cuba, in North Korea. The U.S. has often used the countries such as Sweden and Switzerland to protect its embassies, and this could be easily done in the case of the U.S. and Venezuela right now. In fact, there are talks between the two countries to do this, and that's why it's so important that we hang on in this embassy until an agreement is reached. And once that protecting power agreement is reached, then the U.S. and Venezuela could potentially talk about other issues as well to try to end this crisis that could otherwise lead not only to a takeover of this embassy and a takeover of the U.S. embassy in Caracas, but could lead to a U.S. military intervention, a civil war in Venezuela that could rage on for decades. So we are doing this to uphold international law and to prevent a war.
And Medea, I wanted to ask you in terms of this whole issue of the legitimate government of Venezuela inviting those protesters into the embassy to protect it. The Washington Post had a very interesting article a couple of days ago, supposedly going behind the scenes of the most recent failed coup attempt, because there have already been 3 this year against Maduro. But one of the things it mentions is that President Trump has become increasingly angry that he's believed he was misled at how easy it would be to get rid of Maduro, and he's now angry at his own advisors. And then just I think it was yesterday, Mauricio Claver Caron, one of the key national security people, said in Colombia at a meeting there that he believes that Maduro is totally paranoid and can't trust anybody, and that he can count on one hand the number of people who support Maduro. That's pretty much at odds with the reality of the facts on the ground, but I'm wondering your take on these recent developments.
I think the president is understanding that he was given bad information. The really bad actor in all of this is John Bolton, who is itching for an intervention, and that there has to be a walking back of the U.S. position, because the U.S. has now backed itself against a wall, recognizing somebody who doesn't have the ability to create the kind of uprising that Trump was told he did. And so part of our reasoning to be in the embassy is to help facilitate that walking back. I also want to mention that we have Reverend Jesse Jackson coming to the embassy today, this afternoon at 2:30, with a bunch of religious leaders to say that we need to get food and water into that embassy. And we will also be having a press conference at the UN with the Venezuelan government today at 4 o'clock to talk about the violations of their embassy and how the U.S. must respect the Vienna Conventions.
You know, talking about Trump being frustrated that he was told that they could throw out the democratically elected president of Venezuela, whatever people think of him. Do you have a sense that now with this, that now Trump is just shifting focus to Iran right now, where possibly he thinks, to the shock of many, he could be more successful? The State Department just today ordering all non-emergency personnel to evacuate the U.S. Embassy and consulate in Iraq. The order is in response to what the White House says is a threat linked to Iran, though no further details were given. Iraqi officials expressed expressing skepticism about any purported threats, as did a senior British official who's the deputy commander of the U.S.-led coalition fighting the Islamic State there. And then you have the expose in the New York Times that the Trump administration has ordered the Pentagon to draw up plans to bring 120,000 troops to the region. You just recently returned, Medea Benjamin, from Iran. Can you respond to what's happening right now?
We are very concerned about what's happening now. The U.S. has taken so many measures just in the last year to move towards a war with Iran, starting with pulling out of the nuclear deal, designating the Iran Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization, trying to get the Iranian oil exports down to zero, creating chaos in the Iranian economy. And of course, Iran is going to prepare itself for what looks like an attack. And this is also can be put on John Bolton, who has been calling for an attack on Iran since before he ever got into the administration. I think this is a time where we have to build up an anti-war movement again. We are seeing a repeat of what happened in Iraq with lies, misinterpretations, not only being put out by this administration, but being echoed by the mainstream media, including the New York Times. We have a mobilization at the Venezuelan embassy on Saturday in D.C. That we encourage people to come to. And from there, we're going to be going to the White House to protest this escalation of tensions with Iran and say no to a war with Iran. We have to be pushing our members of Congress to speak out forcefully against what the Trump administration is now doing and to say this is a totally manufactured crisis and the U.S. people will not stand for another war in the Middle East.
And Medea, I want to ask you, President Trump yesterday, after the New York Times report came out, denied that he's actually issued that order to mobilize 120,000 troops. How do you deal with the reality that so many reports that come out about what the Trump administration is planning to do, then Trump himself comes out and says, no, I didn't do that, or I didn't order that, or I'm not doing that. It's very difficult to figure out what the policies of this administration are.
Absolutely. And then in the same breath, he said, I didn't order it, but if we were going to do it, we'd send even more than 120,000 troops. It is, I think, important to understand that these policies are being organized by John Bolton. John Bolton, who is so close to the MEK in the case of Iran. John Bolton, who has said before that he wants to bomb Iran. John Bolton, that is so close to the Saudis and to Israel. And, of course, Donald Trump himself having an even closer relationship to the Saudis and to Israel. Has made the situation in Iran extremely dangerous. The only thing that's going to counter this is if we get Congress to stand up to pass legislation that says we will not allow any unauthorized attack on either Iran or Venezuela. If we get all the presidential candidates to stand up and say no to an attack on Iran, and if we get the American people to be very loud and clear saying we are totally opposed to any attack on Iran. And further than that, we should be calling for a lifting of the crippling economic sanctions in the case of both Iran and Venezuela. We should be calling for the U.S. to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. These are positions that we should demand of our members of Congress, the administration, and all of the presidential candidates.
Medea Benjamin, I want to thank you for being with us, co-founder of Codepink, one of the activists who had lived inside the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., demanding the embassy not be turned over to Venezuelan opposition leaders. She was in Iran earlier this year, the author of several books, including Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection, her latest book, Inside Iran, The Real History and Politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran.